The morning Letitia Pritchard arrived in Caldera Creek, Texas. The sky was the color of a bruise, and Edgar Hawkins was standing at the edge of his property with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man attending his own funeral. It was the spring of 1876, and the Reconstruction had left its marks on the southwestern territories like a boot print in dried mud, visible, permanent, and impossible to ignore. Caldera Creek sat at the edge of Bixar County, a town of roughly 300 souls who had survived drought, Comanche raids, and more than one bank collapse. The land around it was honest in the way only difficult things could be honest. It offered nothing freely and took payment in sweat and calloused hands. Edgar Hawkins understood that kind of honesty. He had built his ranch, the Flat Iron, from a single borrowed mule and 40 acres of scorched earth over the course of 7 years. And now he had 400 acres, a good herd, 3 hired hands, and absolutely no one to share any of it with. That was why, at the age of 31, he had answered the advertisement. The arrangement had been brokered through a correspondence agency out of San Antonio, the sort of service that matched women of practical circumstance with men of practical need. The letter he had written was brief and honest to the point of being almost cruel. He needed a capable woman to manage the household, help with the books, and present a stable domestic image to the bank that held his mortgage note. He was not a man given to sentiment. He would provide financial security, a home, and respectful treatment. He would not provide love, because he believed that love, in the specific romantic sense, was something that happened to people with more time and less trouble than he currently possessed. Letitia Pritchard had written back in a hand that was precise and economical, much like the woman herself would prove to be. She was 24 years old, the youngest daughter of a Philadelphia schoolteacher who had died the previous winter, leaving her without income or prospects in a city that had little patience for women without either. She had 3 younger siblings still living with an aunt, and she intended to send money home whenever she could. She needed a husband who would not drink away his wages or raise his hand to her. She did not need flowers or poetry. She needed a contract she could rely on, and she would fulfill her end of it completely. Edgar had read that letter twice, and then a third time, and then he had written back and said yes. The stagecoach from San Antonio pulled into Caldera Creek at 9:30 in the morning, and Letitia stepped down from it wearing a gray wool traveling dress that was slightly too warm for the Texas spring, carrying a single large trunk and a canvas bag over her shoulder. She was not what Edgar had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was medium height, with dark auburn hair pulled back severely from a face that was composed and watchful, with green eyes that moved over her surroundings with the calculating efficiency of a woman taking inventory. She spotted him immediately, probably because he was the only man standing alone near the depot with a piece of card that read Pritchard. She walked to him with a straight back and an extended hand, the way a business partner might approach a meeting. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. "Miss Pritchard," he said, and shook her hand once firmly. They regarded each other for a moment in the way 2 people regard a contract before signing, searching for the hidden clause, the unfair condition buried in the fine print. "I trust the journey was bearable," he said. "It was long," she said, with a frankness that almost made him smile. "Where is the preacher?" "Reverend Colt at the Methodist Church on Pine Street. He is expecting us at 11. "Then we should not waste time," she said, and picked up her canvas bag. He picked up the trunk without being asked, and they walked side by side through the main street of Caldera Creek, past the general store and the telegraph office and the saloon that was already, at 9:30 in the morning, making sounds from within that suggested at least one person had started the day poorly. A few townspeople glanced at them with unsubtle curiosity. Mabel Hutchins, who ran the dry goods store, actually came to stand in her doorway to watch them pass. Caldera Creek was the kind of town that considered itself entitled to the private details of everyone's life. Edgar ignored the stares. Letitia did not even seem to register them. The wedding ceremony took 11 minutes. Reverend Colt, a thin man with impressive side whiskers and the air of someone who had performed this particular sacrament under a great variety of circumstances, read the words from his worn Bible and said them both to mean their vows. Letitia said "I do" in the clear, steady voice of someone reading a legal declaration. Edgar said it in a lower register, looking at the middle distance just past her left shoulder. There were no rings exchanged. They had not arranged for any. Afterward, Reverend Colt shook Edgar's hand and told Letitia she was welcome at Sunday services, and that was the end of it. They were married. The ride to the Flatiron took 40 minutes in Edgar's wagon, along a dusty road that cut through scrubland and then opened onto rangeland that stretched wide and amber under the morning sun. It was genuinely beautiful country, in the way that difficult things sometimes were, and Letitia watched it with her hands folded in her lap and said nothing for the first 20 minutes. Then she said, "How many head of cattle?" "160 at last count," Edgar said. "Mix of longhorns and some shorthorn crosses I've been bringing in. And the hired men, 3, Calhoun who manages the herd, Domingo who handles fence and water, and Pete who does a bit of everything. They have their own bunkhouse. The financial arrangements with the bank," she said. "I should understand them." He glanced at her. Most women of his acquaintance, including several who had considered him as a potential husband over the years, would not have asked about financial arrangements before asking about the condition of the house. "Mortgage on the land runs another 4 years," he said. "I have been on time every payment. There is also an equipment note I took on last fall for the new baler, which runs another 18 months. Income from cattle sales is seasonal but steady. I keep a ledger. I would like to review it," she said. "I expected you would," he said, and he meant it as neither criticism nor compliment but purely as an observation. She looked at him then, a direct look that he found slightly unsettling, because it was not the coy or nervous look of a woman trying to make a good impression. It was the look of someone deciding whether a piece of information was accurate. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Go ahead. I will be a good wife to you in every practical sense. I will run your household efficiently. I will be civil and cordial, and I will not embarrass you in public. But I do not expect, and I do not want this to become something it was not designed to be. We have a practical arrangement. I intend to honor it as exactly as it was written." Edgar kept his eyes on the road. The horses' hooves raised small puffs of dust that drifted sideways in the warm breeze. "I feel the same," he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and it should have felt comfortable, 2 practical people who had reached a mutual understanding. But there was something in the silence that was harder to categorize. Not tension, exactly. More like the feeling of a room that has just been emptied of furniture. The space was accurate, but it felt different now that something had been arranged inside it. The house surprised her. She did not say so, but he saw it in the slight widening of those green eyes when they came over the low rise and the Flatiron's main house came into view. He had built it himself over 3 years, adding rooms as he could afford to, and it was a proper house by any standard clapboard siding. A covered porch that ran the full front width, glass windows on all the ground floor rooms, and a stone chimney that was solid enough to last another 100 years. He kept it clean. That was the thing that surprised most people, a bachelor rancher keeping a clean house. He carried her trunk to the room he had prepared for her, the east bedroom, which got the morning light, with a good iron bed frame and a cot-stuffed mattress he had ordered from San Antonio 2 weeks earlier. He had also purchased new curtains, white with a small embroidered border, because he had figured that a woman arriving to an arrangement like theirs deserved at least the dignity of clean windows. She stood in the doorway of the room and took it in without speaking for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she sounded like she meant something more than was visible in the words. "There is a wash basin and a pitcher already filled," he said. "Supper is usually at 6. I can manage tonight if you need to rest." "I will manage supper," she said. He nodded and left her to it. That first evening, she made a simple meal from the provisions in the larder: salt pork, boiled beans, cornbread, and strong coffee, and set it on the table with a precision that suggested she had been cooking for a demanding household since she was very young. She had, as it turned out. She sat across from him at the table and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which itself was a kind of small miracle for two strangers sharing their first meal together. "The cornbread is good," Edgar said, because it was. "My mother's recipe," she said. She was not a sentimental woman, but she believed in good cornbread. Something in the way she said it, not sad exactly, but with a particular economy that came from having processed a grief until it was portable, made him look up at her. "When did she pass?" "Last December," she said. "The cold, it went to her lungs." "I am sorry," he said. She looked at him steadily. "So am I." They said nothing more about it that night, but something had shifted, fractionally, like a window opened by a quarter-inch. Not enough to change the temperature of the room, but enough to let in a thread of outside air. The next morning, Edgar rose before dawn as he always did, and found that Letitia had already been up for at least an hour. The kitchen fire was going and there was coffee on. She was standing at the kitchen window in her house dress with her hair in a long braid over one shoulder, reading through the ranch ledger he had left on the side table the previous evening, having assumed she would want it. She was making small notes in the margin with a pencil. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked up at him without any particular surprise, as though it were perfectly ordinary to be discovered annotating a man's financial records at 5 in the morning on the second day of your marriage. "Your equipment note carries a higher interest than necessary," she said. "There is a federal land bank operating out of San Antonio now that offers better rates. If you refinance through them, you would save approximately $40 over the remaining term." Edgar stared at her. "I was a schoolteacher's daughter," she said, by way of explanation, and went back to the ledger. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, and they spent the better part of the next hour going through the ranch accounts together, her pointing out inefficiencies and him explaining the practical realities behind each one. And it was the most direct and useful conversation he had had with another person in longer than he could remember. His 3 hired hands were good men, but they were not the kind for talking, and the last woman he had spent time with, a widow from down near Uvalde who had briefly considered him as a prospect, had spoken only of her children and her late husband's many virtues, which had been plentiful but not particularly interesting. Letitia Pritchard spoke of interest rates and grazing rotation and the best way to balance a seasonal income ledger, and Edgar found himself listening to her the way a man listens when he is genuinely interested, leaning forward slightly without realizing it, asking follow-up questions. By the end of the first week, they had established a rhythm. She ran the house with a quiet efficiency that was genuinely impressive. She reorganized the larder, took stock of the household provisions, established a laundry schedule, and somehow found the time between all of that to take over the record-keeping entirely, presenting Edgar each evening with a summary of the day's accounts that was clearer and more accurate than anything he had managed. She also, he noticed, sent a letter to San Antonio on their 4th day, and he suspected it contained money, though he did not ask. The hired hands adored her almost immediately. Domingo, who was a courtly man from across the Rio Grande with a wife and 2 daughters in Chihuahua that he visited twice a year, called her Senora Hawkins from the first day, and brought her wildflowers from the scrubland on the second, which she accepted with a dignity that managed to be both warm and unsentimental. Calhoun, who was a taciturn Kentuckian of about 40, who communicated primarily through grunts and eyebrow movements, presented her one morning with a small clay pot of honey from a wild hive he had found, which was about as romantically generous as Calhoun got. Pete, who was 22 and from Nacogdoches and still at the age where women made him nervous, had taken to disappearing around corners whenever she came near. Edgar watched all of this with a feeling he could not quite name, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of satisfaction, and somewhere else in the neighborhood of something more complicated. On the 9th day of their marriage, a problem arrived in the form of a man named Radcliffe Bryan. Radcliffe Bryan was a land speculator who had been working the Caldera Creek area for the better part of 2 years, acquiring property through a combination of bought debts, legal maneuvers, and the particular kind of pressure that stopped just short of being illegal without actually being anything other than predatory. He was 38 years old, well-dressed by local standards, and had a smile that was broad and regular, and inspired in most people the instinctive desire to check their pockets. He rode onto the Flatiron on a Tuesday afternoon on a handsome gray horse and asked to speak with Edgar about a business proposition. Edgar met him at the fence gate. "Hawkins," Bryan said, still on horseback, with the easy confidence of a man who preferred to conduct business from the saddle. "I hear you took yourself a wife. Congratulations. What do you want, Bryan?" Bryan pulled a document from his coat, official-looking, heavy paper, multiple seals. "I am putting together a land consortium," he said. "Several of the ranchers south of here have already signed. I am offering fair purchase at $120 an acre for the western parcel of your property. The 40 acres along the creek." Edgar kept his face still. The 40 acres along the creek were the best-watered land on the Flatiron. Without them, the ranch could not sustain its herd through the dry months. "Not interested," Edgar said. Bryan's smile did not waver. "I would think on it more carefully," he said. "Land values in this region are about to change significantly, and a man who does not position himself correctly could find the change works against him." "I know what your kind of change looks like," Edgar said, "and the answer is still no." Bryan touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to convey both courtesy and threat. "I will be back," he said, and turned the gray horse around. Edgar watched him ride out, his jaw tight. He had heard about Bryan from the rancher to his north, a man named Hargrove, who had lost his east pasture to Bryan's consortium through a debt he had not fully understood he was taking on. The legal mechanisms were complex, and the courts in Big Sur County were not always helpful to the small rancher. This was the ongoing reality of the frontier. The land itself was honest, but many of the men who dealt in it were not. He told Letitia about it that evening at supper, out of a sense that she had the right to know what was happening with the property, since she had taken such an interest in its finances. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he had already come to value enormously. "He specifically wants the creek parcel," she said. "Yes, because if he acquires the land along the creek, the ranches on either side of it become dependent on him for water access." Edgar looked at her. "That is exactly it," he said. "Then the creek parcel is the thing worth protecting most carefully," she said. "I want a right to the land bank in San Antonio. There is a form of land patent that offers additional legal protection for water-adjacent parcels. My father had a client who used something similar. He was a farmer in Pennsylvania, but the principle was the same." "Your father had clients," Edgar said. "I thought he was a school teacher." "He was also a notary and an amateur advocate," she said, with a small dry smile that he had not seen from her before and that he found, for a reason he did not examine, worth noting. "He helped working people with their documents. He never charged for it. It was, my mother always said, why we were always poor." Something in the way she said it carried both a gentle criticism and an enormous love, and Edgar felt the weight of it in his chest without being able to say precisely why. "Would you write the letter?" he said. "I already began it this afternoon," she said. He stared at her again. "I saw him ride in," she said simply. "A man dressed that well in this country is either a lawyer or a speculator, and lawyers do not usually arrive uninvited. It seemed worth preparing." He sat with that for a moment, and then he said, with a quiet directness that was very like her own, "You are better at some of this than I am." She met his eyes. "You are better at other parts," she said. "That is presumably why arrangements like ours exist." It was not a romantic statement. It was a statement of partnership, plain and functional, the kind of thing you might say about a good working horse or a reliable plow. But something in the way she held his gaze when she said it made the air between them feel briefly charged, like the sky before a summer thunderstorm. The weeks passed, and Caldera Creek began to incorporate them as a couple in the way small towns do, through incremental acceptance and gradually accumulating witness. They attended Sunday services together. They went to the general store together. They were seen at the town social in May, where the Methodist ladies served lemonade, and 3 musicians played fiddle and guitar on a makeshift stage by the livery stable. Edgar did not dance. He had never learned and considered the entire enterprise with the wariness of a man who does not trust the ground in a new territory. Letitia, it turned out, could dance, her mother had taught her, and she danced a reel with Domingo and a waltz with old Hargrove from the north, and watched Edgar from across the room with that same precise, inventory-taking gaze. He was aware of her watching him. He was more aware of it than he could account for. They were civil to each other always. They were, in fact, more than civil. There was a warmth to their interactions that had grown from nothing into something that had no name yet, something that expressed itself in small daily ways. She always made sure his coffee was poured before her own. He always checked that the porch lamp was lit before she came in at night. She left books on the side table that she thought he might like, choosing them with a precision that suggested she had been paying close attention to his conversation. He fixed the squeaking board on her bedroom floor without being asked, because he had noticed it woke her when she got up early. They were caring for each other the way that people care for each other when they have not yet admitted to themselves that that is what they are doing. The crisis with Radcliffe Buy-in escalated in June. It started with a fence. 3 sections of the Flatirons' western fence line were cut one night, cleanly cut, not broken, the kind of cut that took wire cutters and deliberate intent. 47 head of cattle drifted through the gap before Calhoun noticed in the morning and got them back, but 2 longhorn bulls ended up on Buy-in's recently acquired land to the south, and Buy-in's men claimed they could not find them. Edgar rode to Buy-in's operation personally, accompanied by Calhoun. Buy-in was perfectly pleasant about the whole thing, said his men had seen no stray cattle, suggested the bulls must have wandered further south, and offered Edgar a glass of brandy that Edgar declined. It was infuriating in the way that only things done with complete impunity are infuriating. The knowledge that the wrong had been committed, and that the person who committed it was confident enough to look you in the eye while denying it. Letitia was at the kitchen table when Edgar returned, and she looked at his face and said nothing, only poured him a glass of water and set it in front of him and waited. He told her everything. He told her about the cut fence and the missing bulls and Buy-in's smiling denial, and then he told her something he had not told anyone, that the bank note on the eastern pasture had a renewal clause in 4 months, and that he was concerned Buy-in might have some influence with the bank officer who handled renewals. Letitia listened to all of it. Then she picked up her pencil. "Show me the note," she said. They spent 3 hours that evening going through the mortgage paperwork together, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, their heads bent over the documents. She read every clause and asked questions about each one, and Edgar answered, and somewhere in the course of those 3 hours, without either of them remarking on it, the distance between them at the table shrank until they were sitting close enough that he could see the small scar above her left eyebrow. From a childhood fall, she had mentioned once, and the precise way she underlined important language with a ruler she had brought to the table without asking. "There is a right of first refusal clause here," she said, tapping a paragraph near the end of the note. "If the bank decides not to renew, they must offer you a 60-day purchase period at the note's remaining value. Buy-in cannot acquire it from the bank directly while you are within that 60-day window. I did not know that was in there. Most people do not read the long parts," she said, and there was that dry smile again, and it reached her eyes this time, and he was close enough to see it do so. Their eyes met over the documents and held for a moment longer than they needed to, longer than the purely professional business of the evening required. She looked down first. He looked at the lamp. "Thank you," he said, meaning it very specifically and also somehow meaning more. "Go to bed," she said. "You have to be up in 4 hours and you are no good to the herd if you are exhausted." He went to bed, and he lay in the dark of his room on the west side of the house and listened to the sounds of her moving in the east bedroom across the hall, the quiet settling of the old house around them both, and he thought about the way her hair had caught the lamplight and the way she had looked at him just before looking away, and he told himself firmly that they had an arrangement, and that the arrangement was clear, and that he was a man of his word. He believed all of that very sincerely. He also did not sleep particularly well. The summer deepened into the particular ferocity that Texas summers have, a heat that was not merely warm but physical, something that pressed on you like a hand, that turned the scrubland silver and cracked the earth between the bunchgrass. Letitia adapted to it with the determined practicality she brought to all challenges. She rose earlier to do heavy work in the cool of the morning. She wore lighter dresses in pale cot that she had sewn herself on the sewing machine that she had asked Edgar to order from San Antonio, which had arrived in June on the freight wagon, and which she had operated with the confident precision of someone who had been using one for years. The garden she planted along the south wall of the house was, by July, producing tomatoes and peppers and an enthusiastic quantity of green beans, which she preserved in jars in the cellar and sent some of to Domingo, who sent back through Pete a message so elaborately grateful that Pete could only partially translate it from Spanish. Edgar helped in the garden when he could. He was not a natural gardener. He was a cattle man, and that was where his instincts lay, but he built her a proper trellis for the bean plants on a Sunday morning in late June, and she came out to look at it when he was finishing the last post, and she ran her hand along the top beam and said, "This is very well made," with the same directness with which she said everything, and he felt the compliment land in a way that he was fairly certain a compliment about a trellis had no business landing. She had begun to talk more with him in the evenings. This was a gradual development, like the spring coming. You could not say on any particular day that it had arrived, only that one day you looked around and it was there. She told him about Philadelphia, about her childhood in the row house on Carpenter Street with her father's books taking up every available surface, and her mother's strict insistence on good grammar and good manners, and absolutely no complaining. She told him about her 3 siblings, Robert, who was 12, and Clara, who was 9, and baby Thomas, who was 5, and how she wrote to them every week without fail and sent whatever she could. He found himself telling her things in return. About his own childhood in Mississippi, which he left at 17 with nothing but a mule, and a conviction that the West was where a man could make something from nothing. About the first years on this land, which had been genuinely hard in ways that had bent him close to breaking. About a younger brother named James who had died in the war, the wrong side of the war, the side that history had since concluded was not merely wrong but monstrous, and about the way Edgar had spent years working out what to do with that weight. He did not dress it up. He told her that his family had been slaveholders, that James had died defending that institution, and that it was one of the things in his past that he carried with the specific heaviness of something that cannot be undone. She was quiet for a long moment after he told her that. "I appreciate you telling me the truth of it," she said. "Many men in your position do not." "What do you do with the truth of it?" he asked. "I put it with the rest of the true things," she said. "You are not your brother and you are not your father, but the weight of it is real, and I think it is right that you carry it. It was not absolution and it was not condemnation. It was something more useful than either, which was honest acknowledgement, and he found it deeply settling, in the way that a wound that has been properly cleaned can begin to heal. The letter from the San Antonio Land Bank arrived at the end of July. Letitia's correspondence had produced results. The Western Creek parcel was now registered under a water rights patent that made any speculative acquisition significantly more legally complicated. She read the letter at the kitchen table and handed it across to Edgar without a word, only watching his face as he read it. He read it twice. He set it down. "How did you know to do all of this?" he said. "I paid attention to my father," she said. "And I wrote 11 letters before I got the right one." 11 letters. He had not known she was writing 11 letters. She had done it quietly and persistently and entirely without making it his problem, and the result was that the most vulnerable piece of his land was now legally protected. He was looking at her across the table with something he could not prevent from being visible on his face, and whatever it was, she saw it, because something happened in her own expression, not the composed, cataloging look she wore most often, but something softer and less certain, something that looked like it was trying to decide what it was. She stood up and carried her coffee cup to the basin and said she needed to check on the bean preserves in the cellar, and that was the end of that moment, but it sat in the house for the rest of the day like the smell of rain before a storm. In August, Radcliffe Byron made his last move, and it was a more direct one. He arrived at the Flatiron with 2 men from the county sheriff's office, and a document that he claimed was a court-ordered lien on the western parcel based on a disputed boundary survey he had filed 3 weeks earlier without any notice to Edgar. The document looked legitimate. The 2 deputies looked uncomfortable, which was itself evidence that something was not right about the situation, because deputies in Bixar County were not generally prone to discomfort in the performance of their duties. Edgar read the document twice. He kept his voice and his hands steady, which cost him some effort. Letitia appeared at the porch door. Byron glanced at her with the particular dismissive calculation that men of his type used on women, a single quick assessment, a box checked, a conclusion drawn, all of it wrong. "Letitia," Edgar said, "there is a lien document here regarding the western parcel." She came down the porch steps and he handed her the document, and she stood in the August dust reading it with the same attention she gave to everything. "Mr. Byron," she said, without looking up from the document. "Mrs. Hawkins," Byron said, with his broad smile. "This survey references a boundary marker at the crossing of what it calls Drover's Branch," she said. "What it does not mention is that Drover's Branch was the informal name for a seasonal creek that dried up 18 years ago, and whose location was recorded under a different name in the original patent filing. The parcel you are attempting to claim as disputed is not on this boundary at all. You are off by 3/4 of a mile." The smile did not waver, but something behind it did. "The survey was conducted by a licensed. The survey was conducted by someone working from an 1854 map that predates the drought of 1858, she said, looking up at him now with those green eyes absolutely level. "I have the 1870 Federal Survey record in the house. I wrote to the General Land Office in Austin 6 weeks ago and requested a certified copy. I am happy to show it to these officers and to any judge in Bixar County who would like to review the matter." One of the deputies coughed. Byron's smile contracted by perhaps 10%. "I am sure there are several interpretations." "There is the legal interpretation and there are other interpretations," Letitia said. "I recommend the legal one." "Good day, Mr. Byron." Byron looked at Edgar. Edgar looked back at him with the calm expression of a man who has just watched something remarkable happen and is taking the full measure of it. Byron took his document and his 2 deputies and his handsome gray horse and rode off the Flatiron, and Edgar watched until they were over the ridge, and then he turned to look at his wife standing in the yard with the afternoon sun on her and the August heat making the air shimmer behind her, and he thought, "I am in enormous trouble. Not the kind of trouble with lawyers and liens. The other kind." She turned to him. "You should ride to Austin next week to confirm the survey registration," she said. "Take the certified copy I have and make sure it is filed with the county as well. 2 copies are better." "Letitia," he said. She looked at him. He searched for words and found for the first time in several years that they were genuinely insufficient for what he wanted to say. "Thank you," he finally said, which was not remotely adequate. "You are welcome," she said, as simply as if he had thanked her for passing the salt, and went back up the porch steps into the house. He stood in the yard alone for a while, looking at the door she had gone through, and the feeling in his chest was so large and so unfamiliar that it took him a full 5 minutes to recognize it. He had spent so many years being alone that he had forgotten what it felt like not to be. He did not say anything to her that evening. They had supper. She made roasted chicken and the last of the new potatoes from the garden. And they talked about the Austin trip and the practical details of what needed to be filed and confirmed. And the conversation was useful and clear, and contained absolutely nothing of the vast internal reckoning that was happening somewhere behind Edgar's ribs. That night he lay awake in the west bedroom for a long time, and it was honest thinking, the kind that a man does when he is tired of lying to himself. He was in love with her. He was not a young man prone to flights of emotion. He had not been that young man even when he was young, but he recognized this for what it was, because it was not the giddy feeling of infatuation that he vaguely remembered from a long time ago, but something heavier and more permanent. It was the feeling of someone being essential, of walking into a room and measuring it differently because she was there, of wanting to know everything she had ever thought about every subject, of a kind of specific longing that had her face and her hands and her dry smile at the center of it. And the arrangement was clear. She had been clear. She did not want this to become something it was not designed to be. She was 24 years old with a family to support and a practical life to maintain, and she had chosen this arrangement with her eyes open and her terms stated plainly, and he was a man who respected stated terms. He was still awake at midnight. He did not sleep particularly well again. September came in on a cooler wind that was almost like a kindness after the violence of the Texas summer. The land turned amber and bronze, and the light went long and golden in the afternoons, and Letitia walked the property sometimes in the early evenings when the work of the day was done, just walking the boundary of the flat iron with her hands in her pockets and her hair loose in the breeze. Edgar had watched her do this from a distance several times without meaning to, and he was always struck by the way she looked in those moments. Not the composed and efficient person of the household, but something quieter and more private, someone in a conversation with the land itself. He was coming back from the north pasture on a Thursday in mid-September when he encountered her returning from one of these walks, and they fell into step together naturally, the way they had been falling into step together for months now, side by side along the track that led back to the house. "You walk the fence line," he said. "I like to know the extent of things," she said. "That is a very particular way to think about a walk." "I am a particular person," she said, and there was a warmth in it that had not been there in the earliest days. They walked a little further. The evening light came long and orange across the grassland. "Do you like it here?" he asked. The question surprised him slightly by coming out. He had not planned it. She considered for a moment, and he appreciated that she did not answer immediately because a fast answer would have been a polite one. She was looking at the horizon, where the sun was making its slow, dramatic exit behind the western hills. "I did not expect to," she said. "I thought I would make the best of it, which is not the same thing. And now—" She looked at him then sideways, with the October light in her eyes and her hair moving slightly in the cooling air. "Now I think it is exactly large enough," she said. He held her gaze. "Letitia," he said, and then stopped, because what he had been about to say was real and heavy and irreversible. "Edgar," she said, and her voice had changed, had lost the perfectly calibrated evenness she normally maintained, had something underneath it now that he had no practice reading in her, but that felt very much like something he recognized from within himself. "I know what we agreed," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am not trying to go back on the agreement. What are you trying to do?" He looked at her fully. He was not a man who was gifted with eloquent speech, and he knew it, and he decided to simply say the true thing without decoration. "I am trying to tell you that the agreement no longer describes what I feel," he said. "I am not asking you to feel the same. I am just saying it because it is true, and I think you have the right to know what is true." The silence that followed was long and particular. A nighthawk called somewhere out in the scrub. The last light was going off the land. "Edgar," she said again, "you do not have to say anything." "I am trying to," she said, and there was something in her voice that he had not heard before, something that was almost frustrated, as though she were working against herself. This is not something I planned for. I know that. I have worked very hard not to plan for it." Something in the careful honesty of that made his heart turn over. "I know that too," he said softly. She looked at him for a long moment with those green eyes that he had been trying not to look at directly for approximately 3 months. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said, and he meant it. They walked back to the house in a different kind of silence than any they had walked in before. This one had things in it. He held the porch door open for her, and she went inside. And he stood on the porch for a few minutes in the darkening evening, listening to the horses settle in the corral and the first night insects starting up. And he told himself that he had done the right thing in saying it, regardless of how it landed, because she deserved the truth, and he was a man who tried to deal in truth even when it was expensive. He went inside, and the house smelled like whatever she had left on the stove for supper, something with dried chili and beef, and he thought that he would very much like to come home to that smell every evening for the rest of his life, and that thought was so large and so clear that he almost said it out loud to the empty kitchen. He did not. She was quiet at supper. Not cold, she asked him about the work in the north pasture, and listened to his answers and passed him the cornbread without being asked, because she had noticed weeks ago that he always wanted 2 pieces, but quiet in a way that was clearly interior, that had an active quality to it, as though she were turning something over in her mind with the same careful attention she gave to a difficult ledger. After supper, she excused herself early. He sat on the porch in the dark with his coffee going cold in his hand and watched the stars come out over the flat horizon and thought about patience, which had never been his strongest quality but which he could summon when the thing being waited for was worth the wait. He went to bed. At some point in the night, he was not sure of the exact hour, somewhere in the deep middle of it, when the darkness was at its most absolute. He woke up for no reason that he could identify. The house was quiet. The night insects were still. A small sound had woken him, or perhaps no sound, perhaps only the particular sixth sense that a man develops when he has lived alone in a large land for long enough. He lay still for a moment, and then he saw it. Under the door of his room, the door that faced the hall, and across the hall, her door, there was a line of warm light, not the blue white of moonlight, the amber warm light of a candle. He sat up slowly. The light was coming from under his door, which meant it was in the hallway, which meant she had placed it in the hallway, which meant she had gotten up in the middle of the night and lit a candle and put it somewhere between their 2 rooms. He sat with that for a moment and let the full weight of its meaning settle into him like water settling into the earth, slow and complete. He got up. He opened his door. She was standing in the hallway in her nightgown and her long braid with a candle in a ceramic holder set on the small table at the end of the hall, and she was looking at him with those green eyes in the candlelight with an expression that contained about 12 different things at once. But the one that was topmost and most visible was the one he recognized from himself, the one that had been trying to be contained for months and had finally run out of room. "I have been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "I could see the light under my door." She looked at the candle and then back at him. "I did not know how else to. I did not want to knock." She stopped, tried again. "I do not know how to do this. I specifically chose an arrangement that did not require me to know how to do this." "Letitia," he said, "I am talking." "I know, go on." She drew a breath. In the candlelight she was very beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She was simply herself, unguarded, standing in the middle of the night in a hallway of a house she had come to knowing exactly what it was and had somehow, despite all her careful intentions, found more in. "I did not want to feel this," she said. "It seemed like a complication, it seemed like a risk I could not afford." "And now," he said quietly, she looked at him steadily, "and now it seems like a much larger risk not to say it." He moved toward her across the 3 feet of hallway between them, and she did not move back, and he took her face in both his hands, careful, like something he was afraid of breaking, though she was not breakable. She was one of the least breakable people he had ever encountered, and looked at her in the candlelight and said, "I love you, Letitia Hawkins." She put her hands on his chest, and something in her face went very quiet and very still, the way the land goes still just before a long-needed rain. "I love you too," she said, and it came out plainly and precisely, no flourish, no excess, entirely like her. "Edgar." He kissed her then, and she kissed him back, and the candle between them threw their shadows long and joined up the hallway wall, and outside the Texas night was warm and enormous and full of stars, and the flat iron settled around them like an exhaled breath. In the morning, everything was the same and everything was different. They had coffee together in the kitchen as they always did, but the space between them had changed its nature. It was closer now, without any specific gesture to account for the change, simply a proximity that had become natural. She brought his coffee to the table instead of leaving it on the stove, and he thanked her with a look that held more than the word, and she received it with a warmth in her face that she was no longer particularly interested in maintaining a careful distance from. Domingo arrived to report that the fence along the south boundary had been checked and held sound, and he looked at the two of them at the kitchen table, and something in his broad face expanded with a satisfied recognition that he had the grace not to remark on directly, though he wished them a particularly warm good morning. The days that followed were the best days Edgar could remember in a life that had had some good ones. Not because they were dramatic, they were not particularly. The work of the ranch went on, the herd needed managing, the accounts needed keeping. Radcliffe Bryan had gone very quiet since Letitia's confrontation in the yard, which suggested he had taken legal counsel and received the counsel he deserved. Life on the Flatiron in the early autumn of 1876 was full and demanding and largely beautiful. But it was different now because they were in it together in a way that was no longer a contract and had become something with no fixed term and no exit clause. She still managed the books, and he still managed the herd. She still wrote to her siblings every week and sent money when she could. He still rose before dawn and came in with dust on his boots, and sometimes a scratch from a fence post or a bruise from a stubborn longhorn. These things did not change. What changed was the quality of the evenings, the way they sat together on the porch after supper and talked, not about business, though they talked about that too, but about everything, about the world and the books she pressed on him and the letters she got from Robert, who was 12 and clearly brilliant, and the political news that came in the weekly paper from San Antonio, and the way the stars moved overhead. She began to laugh with him. That was the thing he treasured most particularly, her laugh, which was rare and genuine and came out surprised sometimes, as though she had not expected it, and which she did not attempt to suppress once she stopped trying to maintain the careful distance. She laughed at things he said. He found himself, for the first time in years, actually trying to be funny, because the reward of her laugh was considerable. October turned to November, and the first real cold of the year came down from the north in a blue-sky norther that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an hour, the particular violence of a Texas cold front. Letitia, who had grown up in Philadelphia and thought she knew what cold was, stood on the porch watching the cold front arrive with her arms wrapped around herself and her hair flying in the sudden wind, and she looked both startled and delighted, the way she looked when the land surprised her, which it did regularly because she paid such close attention to it. Edgar brought his coat from inside and put it over her shoulders without asking, and she pulled it around herself and looked up at him over her shoulder, and he stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and they watched the horizon turn pewter together, and she leaned back against him slightly, just slightly, the smallest degree of leaning, and it was the most natural thing that had ever happened to him. In November, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. She was at the kitchen table when it came, brought by Pete from the post office in town with his customary combination of speed and noisiness. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope and opened it with the careful precision she used for everything, but her hands were not quite as steady as usual. Edgar was across the room at the window, and he watched her read it, watched the changes in her face, and he waited. She set the letter down. "It is Robert," she said. "He has been accepted to study at a teacher's college in the fall. There is some scholarship money, but the rest the aunt cannot manage the rest." "How much is the rest?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic of their situation, which was not desperate but was not particularly generous either, with the equipment note still running and the winter feed bills coming up. "We can manage it," he said. She looked at him. "Edgar, he should go," Edgar said. "A boy like that should have the education." She held his gaze for a moment, and something moved in her face that was old and deep, something that had been carefully held for a long time. "My father always said the same thing about education," she said quietly. "Then your father was right," Edgar said. "We will manage the money. Write to Robert." She stood up and crossed the kitchen to him and put her arms around him in a way she had not done before, not this completely and not this without reserve, and he held her tightly and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The winter was cold and full, and the house was warm. She learned to make the venison stew that Calhoun left the recipe for, scrawled in his laborious hand on a folded piece of paper, and it turned out to be excellent. He learned to read aloud to her in the evenings from the books she had brought in her trunk, which ranged from a volume of essays by Frederick Douglass to a collection of English poetry to a surprisingly gripping account of natural philosophy, and they discussed all of it with equal seriousness and occasional passionate disagreement. She had opinions. She had fierce, well-reasoned, completely unapologetic opinions about everything from crop rotation to the morality of the territorial government to the poetry of Tennyson, and she expressed them with the same direct precision she brought to the account books. He disagreed with her about Tennyson, and they had an argument about it one evening that lasted an hour and a half and involved considerable volume, and ended with them both laughing at themselves. Domingo, coming to the door during this argument to report something about the south fence, took one look at the state of the kitchen and retreated quietly, and reported to Calhoun and Pete later that evening that the boss and his wife were having a very good argument, which was, Domingo explained from the perspective of a man who had been married for 15 years, a very good sign. Christmas that year was the first Christmas Edgar had not spent alone in 7 years. She made tamales with Domingo's instructions, and a kind of sweet bread pudding from a recipe she had memorized from her mother, and they had Pete and Calhoun and Domingo at the table for Christmas dinner. And Domingo sang 2 songs after dinner in a voice that was significantly better than anyone had been prepared for. And Pete got slightly red from the cider, and told a very long story about a horse that turned out to have no particular ending, but was somehow entertaining regardless. When the hired hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean and the fire was banked, Letitia found Edgar on the porch in the cold night air and stood beside him looking at the winter stars, and he put his arm around her and she put her head against his shoulder, and it was simple and complete in the way that simple things sometimes are. "I want to bring Robert here for the summer," she said, "before he starts at the college." "Write and invite him," Edgar said. "And Clara if she can come, and Thomas." "Letitia," he said, "your family is welcome in this house any time and for any length of time. It is your house." She was quiet for a moment. "I wrote that first letter to the agency," she said. "I wrote it sitting in the cold of my aunt's back room at 10 o'clock at night with 3 children asleep across the hall and my mother 6 weeks in the ground and absolutely no idea what else to do. And I told myself it would be survivable and possibly even adequate." "And," he said, She tilted her head to look at him, and her face in the winter starlight was everything. "And it is so much more than I wrote for," she said. He kissed her hair. "So is mine," he said. Spring came again, the second spring, and with it a fullness that the first spring had not had, because the first spring had been a beginning and this spring was an arrival. The garden went in bigger than last year, because Letitia had planned it over the winter with the same strategic attention she gave to the ranch accounts, and by June it was producing in quantities that required Domingo's enthusiastic assistance in the harvesting. Robert arrived in June. He was 12 years old, thin and sharp-eyed, and possessed of a quality that Letitia clearly recognized in him because it was her own quality, a kind of precise watchfulness, an attention to everything. He regarded Edgar on arrival with a boy's careful assessment of a new adult, which Edgar met with the same direct straightforwardness he used with everyone. And by the second day, Robert was following him around the property asking questions about cattle in the specific rapid-fire way that very intelligent children do when they have found something that interests them. Clara arrived 3 days after Robert, accompanied by the aunt who stayed only a week but who reassured herself visibly over the course of that week that Letitia was genuinely well and genuinely happy, because she had been worried in the way that older women worry about young women who make unusual choices. Thomas was 5 and attached himself to Pete with the immediate conviction of a small child who has recognized a kindred spirit, which Pete, who was 22 and from Nacogdoches, received with the slightly terrified but ultimately delighted expression of a young man who has never been anyone's hero before. The summer was full and noisy in the way of a house with children in it, and Edgar, who had been alone in this house for 7 years, found that the noise did not bother him in the way he had always assumed it would. He had assumed he had become constitutionally unsuited to other people. He discovered instead that he had simply been waiting for the right other people. He and Robert spent several evenings on the porch talking, and Edgar, who had said very few things in his life that he would describe as wise, managed to say one of them when Robert, whose intelligence occasionally outran his experience, expressed a frustration with his own limitations. "The only thing worse than not knowing something," Edgar told him, "is pretending you do. Honest ignorance is the beginning of learning. Just ask the question." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Letitia says things like that," he said. "Your sister is one of the wisest people I have ever met," Edgar said, with complete sincerity. Robert looked at him with those sharp eyes for a moment, and then he nodded in the slow way of a boy who has confirmed something he was already mostly sure of. In September, Letitia told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning at the kitchen table with the same direct plainness she brought to all important information. She sat down across from him and said, "I believe I am with child. I want to have Dr. Hennessy confirm it, but I believe it." He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a moment with everything he felt on his face, making no effort to manage or reduce it. "Are you well?" he said. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said, "in the mornings." "But well." He got up from the table and went around to her and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead, and she put her hands over his wrists and held on. "All right," he said softly. "All right." Dr. Hennessy confirmed it 2 days later. Letitia was expecting in the early spring, somewhere around March. She was healthy and strong, the doctor said, and the pregnancy looked well positioned. She came out of the doctor's office on Caldera Creek's Main Street into the September afternoon and looked at Edgar waiting for her on the sidewalk with his hat in his hands and said, "March." "March," he said. They stood on the wooden sidewalk of a small Texas town in the fall of 1877, looking at each other with the gravity and the joy of it equally visible in both their faces. "We should tell Domingo first," she said, with absolute certainty. "He will be insufferably pleased." Domingo was, in fact, insufferably pleased. He brought wildflowers from the scrubland the next morning, which was now his established custom for significant events, and spoke at such length about the virtues of children and the joys of family that even Calhoun, a man not given to visible emotion, was observed to clear his throat several times. The winter was quiet and busy and preparing. Letitia worked with her usual efficiency for as long as she could manage it, which was longer than Edgar felt comfortable with but shorter than she would have preferred, and they arrived at a negotiated middle ground through a series of conversations that were very characteristic of both of them. She had strong opinions about not being managed. He had strong opinions about her not lifting the water buckets. They reached a compromise on both points that satisfied neither of them completely and therefore probably satisfied both of them adequately, which was more or less how their best negotiations went. He built a cradle. He was not a carpenter by training, but he was good with wood, and he had watched his father build things when he was small, and he spent 3 weeks on it in the evenings in the small workshop behind the house, working by lamplight when the day's work was done. Letitia did not know he was building it. He had closed the workshop door and told Pete not to mention it, and Pete, who was genuinely devoted to both of them by this point, maintained the secret with more successful discretion than anyone had expected from him. He brought it in from the workshop on a December morning and put it in the room they had made ready, the east bedroom, which had been hers, and was now to be the nursery, they having long since consolidated into the larger west bedroom together. He put the cradle by the window where it would get the morning light. She found it in the afternoon when she went to check on the room. He was on the porch when he heard her moving inside and then going still, and a moment later she appeared in the doorway of the house. Her face was very full. "Edgar Hawkins," she said. He looked at her. "You made that," she said. It was not a question. "Tried to," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with those green eyes, and then she came to the porch and took his face in her hands instead of his hands on her face, and she kissed him and held on, and he held her and felt the slight changed shape of her against him and the future in it, solid and warm and real. "It is beautiful," she said. "You have not looked at it very carefully," he said. "I have looked at exactly what it needs," she said firmly. The baby came in late February, not quite March. He arrived on a cold, clear night with the winter stars very bright and Dr. Hennessy making the long ride out to the Flatiron in impressive time, and Letitia, who went through labor with the determined, quiet concentration she brought to all challenges, produced at the end of it a boy who weighed 8 pounds and came into the world apparently already somewhat annoyed at the inconvenience. He had Edgar's dark coloring and Letitia's particular watchfulness even in his first hour of life, though the watchfulness at this stage expressed itself primarily as a focused attention to the business of being fed, which he undertook with considerable conviction. They named him Thomas James Hawkins. Thomas for her youngest brother and James for Edgar's brother who had died, an acknowledgment, they both felt, that names could carry memory without carrying guilt, that the dead could be honored without the honors endorsing what they had done. Domingo brought wildflowers in late February. Calhoun brought the honey again. Pete brought a small wooden horse he had carved himself, which was touching, and which demonstrated conclusively that Pete's talents lay primarily outside wood carving, but which was accepted with the warmth and sincerity it deserved. Thomas James Hawkins was a loud and vigorous and extremely opinionated infant, which surprised no one who had met either of his parents. He grew. The seasons turned. The Flatiron grew too, not extravagantly, but steadily, the way things grow when tended by people who pay close attention and play the long game. Edgar brought in new breeding stock and expanded the herd. Letitia, who had returned to the books and the household management with brisk efficiency by the time Thomas was 3 months old, completed the refinancing of the equipment note through the San Antonio Land Bank, saving exactly the $40 she had predicted. She also established a small kitchen garden operation that supplied 3 of the town businesses with preserved produce, which brought in supplemental income that was modest but not negligible, and which she tracked in a separate ledger with the characteristic precision of a woman who believed that every dollar deserved accurate accounting. Robert came for the following summer and the one after that. He started at the Teachers' College in the autumn of 1878 and wrote detailed letters about it that arrived weekly and that Letitia read aloud in the evenings. He had decided he wanted to teach in the territories, where, he wrote, there was more actual need and more actual work to be done. "He sounds like you," Edgar said. "He sounds like our father," Letitia said, with a particular quality in her voice that was grief and pride simultaneously. "That is not mutually exclusive," Edgar said. She looked at him. "You are very like your father sounds," Edgar said. "That is a fact and not a complaint. It is one of the things I love most about you." She looked at him for a long moment, and the full warmth of that was in her face. "I sometimes think about the letter I wrote to that agency," she said. "How careful I was, how deliberate, how I specified exactly what I wanted and exactly what I would not allow for. And—" she smiled, the full smile, the one that reached her eyes and transformed her face, and that he had been collecting for almost 2 years like a man who knows the value of what he is keeping. "And I think my father would have laughed very much at how precisely I missed what I actually needed," she said. In the summer of 1879, they had a daughter. They named her Mary Ellen, Mary for Letitia's mother and Ellen for a woman of no particular significance, except that Edgar said the name sounded right and Letitia agreed, which was itself a kind of history. Mary Ellen was from her first days a tranquil and observant child who looked at the world with a patience her brother had never possessed, and who, from the age of 6 months, regarded her father with a particular expression of tolerant affection that Letitia said was clearly a genetic disposition, because she recognized it from her own mirror. Edgar held his daughter in the evenings on the porch and talked to her about the land and the cattle and the stars, because babies did not care what you said, and he found the conversation clarifying. Thomas, who was a year old and mobile and increasingly determined, staged regular and unsuccessful attempts to climb the porch railing, which required Letitia to intercept him with the patient frequency of a border collie managing an extremely willful sheep. The Flatiron by the autumn of 1879 was a proper working ranch with a real house and a real family in it, and a history of its own beginning. The mortgage note had 3 more payments left. The western parcel with its creek land was firmly and legally protected. Radcliffe Bryan had moved his operations further south the previous year after the land bank in San Antonio had declined to do business with him, following certain inquiries that may or may not have been prompted by a very well-written letter from Letitia to the bank's board of directors, a letter that listed the documented history of Bryan's activities in Bexar County, with a specificity that had reportedly caused the bank president some difficulty with his digestion. Caldera Creek had grown. The railroad spur had come through from San Antonio the previous year, which had brought new settlers and new commerce, and had transformed the dusty Main Street into something with pretensions to a real town. There was now a school with 2 teachers and a bank branch and a doctor's surgery, and a dress shop that Letitia visited occasionally with the same strategic attention she gave to everything. And on the Main Street's southwestern corner, where the old livery had burned down, there was a new hotel. Domingo had gone back to Chihuahua permanently that spring, with his savings and a very warm farewell from the entire household, including Thomas, who had apparently decided that Domingo was his personal property, and produced a scene of sufficient emotional volume that Domingo wept openly and unself-consciously, which was very like him, and which everyone present would remember for a long time. He had been replaced by a young man named Santos, who was quieter but equally capable. Calhoun was still there, managing the herd, still communicating primarily through grunts and eyebrow movements, but having added to his repertoire a specific expression for the 2 children that could only be described as helpless tenderness, which he would have denied with great energy if accused of it. Pete was still there too, grown up noticeably from the nervous boy of 2 years earlier, now a competent young man who had begun courting the schoolteacher's daughter in town, a development that Letitia encouraged with quiet effectiveness, and Edgar observed with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a good young person find their bearings. On an evening in October of 1879, which was 3.5 years from the morning Letitia had arrived at the Caldera Creek stagecoach depot in her gray traveling dress with her single trunk and her businesslike handshake, Edgar sat on the porch of the flat iron in the last of the October light and listened to the sounds of his household. Thomas's voice from inside, narrating something to no one in particular in the emphatic way of a boy who had recently discovered that language was a powerful tool. Mary Ellen's periodic quiet commentary. Letitia's voice, calm and precise, answering Thomas's questions with the patient attention she had clearly inherited from her schoolteacher father. The land was amber and enormous in the October light, stretching to the horizon in every direction that a man could look, the scrubland and the grassland and the creek bottom's dark line of cottonwoods catching the last gold of the sun. It was beautiful. It was his. It was hers. He heard her footstep on the boards behind him and did not turn. She came and sat beside him on the porch bench, not in her chair but on the bench next to him, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the cooling air watching the light go off the land. "Thomas has asked me 4 times this afternoon where beef comes from," she said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it comes from cattle. He would like a full explanation of the subsequent steps which I have deferred to you. Of course you have. You are better equipped for that explanation than I am," she said, with a dry smile in her voice. He laughed and she laughed, and the October evening settled around them. The note on the flat iron's mortgage was paid in full the following February, 3 years ahead of the original schedule, through a combination of a very good cattle sale the previous autumn and the quiet discipline of 2 people who managed money with the same attentiveness they brought to everything else. Edgar rode to Caldera Creek with Letitia on the wagon on a cold, clear February morning, and they sat across the desk from the bank officer, who was a different and considerably more honest officer than the one Letitia had originally worried about, and signed the final payoff papers, and came out into the February sun with the deed free and clear, and the mortgage note stamped paid in full. Edgar held the deed in his hands on the sidewalk of Caldera Creek's Main Street. Letitia stood beside him reading it over his shoulder. She always read over his shoulder, and he had long since stopped finding it anything other than characteristic and dear. "It is ours," he said. "It is ours," she said. He looked at her. She was 28 years old now, and the 3.5 years of Texas sun and wind had given her color, and a particular quality of ease in the landscape that the composed Philadelphia woman of that first morning had not had. She was more beautiful to him every year, not despite the changes but including them, because every change was the mark of a life she had fully inhabited, and she inhabited it more completely and more honestly than anyone he had ever known. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Go ahead," she said, which was what he always said to her. "The day you stepped off that stagecoach," he said, "I was the most closed-off man in Bixar County. I had decided very firmly that I was not the kind of person to whom certain things happened, love being chief among them." She was watching him with complete attention. "You did not argue me out of that position," he said. "You just lived your life in this house with absolute honesty and absolute capability, and you made the house so different that the position stopped making sense. I had no idea how to want something I had decided to not allow for. And then I did, and it was you, and that is the most important thing that has ever happened to me." She held his gaze for a long moment in the winter sun. "Edgar Hawkins," she said, "you are going to make me cry on the main street of Caldera Creek. Would that be a catastrophe?" "It would be extremely undignified," she said, but her voice had wavered slightly, and she was smiling with everything, with her whole face. He put his hand over hers where it rested on the wagon rail. "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked at him and then at the street and then up at the winter sky and then back at him. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she said, with a simplicity and a completeness that meant everything he could have asked for. He squeezed her hand. They drove home along the road that cut through scrubland and opened onto rangeland, the same road he had driven the morning she arrived, the same amber grassland and the same sky, though today the sky was clear winter blue instead of bruised, and the flat iron came over the low rise and sat there solid and clapboard white with its covered porch and its glass windows and its stone chimney, and Thomas was visible in the yard near the barn, already conducting some investigation into something that would require parental attention, and Santos was at the corral gate, and Calhoun was somewhere out in the north pasture, and Mary Ellen was presumably inside in her cradle where Letitia had left her in Calhoun's wife's capable temporary care, and the whole of it was exactly as real and as full as anything on this earth could be. They had begun with a letter and a handshake and a practical arrangement, and they had built from those plain materials something that outran every specification either of them had written. The years ahead would hold what years hold: difficulty and weather and work and loss, and all the ordinary, extraordinary business of a life. But they would hold it together, which changes the weight of everything. Thomas would grow up to know the land and love it, and eventually go north to study law, returning with ideas and a quiet steadiness very like his mother's. Mary Ellen would become, in time, a teacher, which no one who knew Letitia would find surprising. There would be another child, a second boy, James Robert, named in full so neither name had to be incomplete, who would have Edgar's stubbornness and Letitia's precision, and a laugh that could be heard from one side of the flat iron to the other. Robert would teach in the territories as he had planned, and write letters about his students with the same love their father had felt for his, and Letitia would read these letters aloud on the porch in the evenings, with a pride in her voice that was as unguarded and complete as the Texas sky above them. The creek parcel held. The land was theirs. The house was warm, and in the hallway of the flat iron, on the small table at the end of the hall, there was always a candle holder. Letitia kept it there always, even when the candle itself was unlit, as a kind of private monument to a night and a decision, and a single thread of amber light under a closed door that had changed everything. Edgar passed it every day without comment and understood its meaning without needing to name it, the way the best things between two people are held not in words, but in the specific objects and gestures that carry what language cannot quite lift. He understood the candle. He had understood it from the moment he had seen the light under his door that dark September night, that she had not knocked, had not said the thing directly, had found instead a way of showing that the door was no longer what she needed to keep herself behind, and had simply lit the light and left it there for him to see. He was a man who had always known how to read land, how to look at a piece of ground and understand its nature and its promise and its history. He had not expected, at 31, to also learn how to read a candle in a window. He was very glad that he had. Outside the flat iron, the Texas sky did what it always did. It was enormous and honest and demanded nothing except that you look at it directly, and it gave in return exactly what it promised: the sun in the morning, the stars at night, and the particular irreplaceable beauty of an open country that belongs to those willing to know it fully. Letitia Hawkins knew it fully. Edgar Hawkins knew it fully. And the house on the rise of the Flat Iron Ranch in Bixar County, Texas, in the year 1880 and all the years that followed, was exactly as full and as warm as two people with all of their practicality and all of their love between them could make it, which was, it turned out, very full indeed.